It only took one tournament to raise a question the WNBA never expected to face this publicly. What if everything fans were told about Caitlin Clark wasn't the full story? Because what just happened on the international stage didn't come from debate, podcasts, or social media arguments. It came from something far more difficult to dismiss: the game itself. Same player, same skill set, same aggressive style, but suddenly a completely different result. And not by a small margin either. This was a shift so obvious that even casual viewers started asking questions within minutes. When Clark stepped into a FIBA officiated environment, something changed immediately. The kind of contact that had been a constant part of her rookie season, it didn't just decrease, it was actually called. Drives to the rim that once ended in silence now ended with a whistle. Off-ball contact that previously went unnoticed was suddenly being enforced like it mattered. And that's where things started to feel uncomfortable. Because for months, the explanation had been simple. She needed to adjust, the league was more physical, this was just part of the process. Fans heard it over and over again until it almost became accepted as fact. But now, with a completely different set of officials and zero connection to WNBA storylines, that explanation doesn't land the same way anymore. The difference wasn't subtle. It wasn't something you needed slow-motion replays or advanced stats to understand. You could see it in real time. You could feel it in the pace of the game. And most importantly, you could compare it instantly. And once that comparison exists, you can't unsee it. Because this isn't just about one player having a good stretch of games. It's about what happens when the exact same player is placed into two completely different systems and suddenly looks like a completely different version of herself. So now the question isn't whether something changed. The real question is, why did it change at all? The shift didn't build slowly. There was no adjustment period, no gradual improvement over weeks of play. It happened almost instantly the moment Caitlin Clark stepped onto the international floor. From the opening possessions, something felt different, and it wasn't her game. It was everything happening around her. On her very first drives, the contact came, and so did the whistle. Not after repeated hits, not after visible frustration, immediately. Defenders who had been able to lean, bump, and disrupt her rhythm without consequence suddenly had to think twice, because now every bit of contact carried a risk. And that single change altered the entire dynamic of the game within minutes. What stood out wasn't just the calls, it was how predictable they were. Under FIBA officiation, the rules felt consistent. If there was contact, it was called. If there wasn't, play continued. No guessing, no gray area. And for a player like Clark, whose game thrives on timing, spacing, and precision, that clarity unlocked something that had been missing. You could see it in her body language. The hesitation that occasionally crept into her drives during the WNBA season, gone. The quick glances towards referees after absorbing contact, gone. Instead, there was a level of confidence that only shows up when a player knows exactly how the game is going to be called. And the results followed just as quickly. Her scoring came easier, but more importantly, it came cleaner. Shots weren't forced through contact, they were created with space. Passing lanes opened up as defenders backed off just enough to avoid fouls. The entire floor looked different, even though the court dimensions hadn't changed at all. That's when it clicked for a lot of viewers. Because this wasn't about her suddenly improving overnight. It wasn't a new skill, a new move, or a different role. It was the same player operating under a different set of conditions and producing at a level that immediately raised eyebrows. And just like that, the conversation started to shift. Not loudly at first, more like a quiet realization spreading across fans and analysts watching the same thing unfold in real time. Because when a change this dramatic happens this fast, it forces a question that's hard to ignore. If nothing about the player changed, what did? What started as a noticeable difference quickly turned into something much bigger. The realization that this wasn't just about a few extra calls. It was about a completely different standard. And once people began comparing possessions side by side, the gap became impossible to ignore. During her rookie season in the WNBA, Caitlin Clark was one of the most heavily pressured guards in the league. Defenders played her physically from the moment she crossed half court. Off-ball contact, hand checks, body bumps on drives, these weren't occasional moments. They were part of nearly every game she played. And yet, the whistle rarely reflected that level of contact. At the time, many accepted it as part of the league's physical style, but behind the scenes, analysts and fans started noticing something unusual. When you compared Clark's usage rate, how often she handled the ball, attacked the rim, and created offense, to historical data from similar players, the numbers didn't line up. Players with her level of offensive responsibility typically draw more fouls. That's been consistent across basketball for years. But in her case, that expected pattern just wasn't there. Now, to be clear, there's been a lot of online discussion around this, and not all of it is verified. Some reports and fan breakdowns suggest that her foul drawing rate was noticeably lower than players with comparable roles. Others argue it was just a byproduct of defensive schemes designed specifically to disrupt her. The truth likely sits somewhere in between, but the questions didn't come out of nowhere. And that's where the international comparison changed everything. Because under FIBA officiating, that statistical gap appeared to correct itself almost immediately. Contact that had previously gone uncalled was now being enforced in a consistent, rule-based way. The same types of drives, the same kinds of defensive pressure, but suddenly the outcomes were different. It didn't require advanced metrics to see it. The rhythm of the game told the story. Defenders couldn't apply the same level of physical disruption without consequences, and once that pressure eased, even slightly, Clark's efficiency and control of the game noticeably improved. That's what makes this so difficult to dismiss, because if the difference was small, it could be explained away. If it took weeks to develop, it could be called adjustment. But this happened immediately in a completely different officiating environment, with no prior connection to league narratives or player hierarchies. And that leaves a very narrow set of possibilities. Either the entire interpretation of her rookie season was incomplete, or something about how those games were being officiated wasn't as consistent as it seemed. And once that possibility enters the conversation, it doesn't just stay there quietly. It forces people to go back, re-watch, and question everything they thought they understood. For most of the 2024 season, the explanation never really changed. Every time the conversation came up, it circled back to the same idea. Caitlin Clark just needed time. Time to adjust, time to adapt, time to understand what professional basketball really feels like at the highest level. It sounded reasonable. In fact, it sounded familiar. Almost every rookie hears some version of it. The WNBA is physical. Veterans are stronger, smarter, more experienced. You earn your calls over time. That was the message, repeated across broadcasts, interviews, and analysis segments until it became the default explanation. And to many viewers, it made sense, at least on the surface, because there's truth in it. Professional leagues are tougher. Rookies do go through adjustment periods, and veterans often understand how to use physicality to their advantage. But what made this situation different was how consistently that single explanation was applied, no matter what the actual footage showed. There were games where the contact looked excessive, possessions where multiple angles showed clear body checks or disrupted movement with no whistle, moments that sparked debate online almost instantly. And yet, the response rarely changed. It was framed as part of her learning curve, something she needed to figure out.
Over time, that framing started to feel less like analysis and more like a fixed narrative. Because instead of asking whether the officiating matched the level of contact, the conversation kept redirecting back to the player. The focus stayed on what she needed to do differently, rather than whether the environment around her was being evaluated at all. And that's where things begin to shift. Because once FIBA officials entered the picture, that narrative lost its foundation almost overnight. The same player, facing similar defensive pressure, suddenly wasn't struggling to adjust anymore. The physicality didn't disappear, but the way it was handled did. Now, it's important to be fair here. There's no confirmed evidence of any coordinated effort or intent behind how games were officiated. A lot of what's being discussed comes from fan observations, analyst breakdowns, and comparisons that are still being debated. But what can't be ignored is how dramatically the conversation changed once a new officiating standard was introduced. Because if the original narrative were entirely accurate, if this was purely about adjustment, then you would expect that process to continue no matter where she played. But that's not what happened. Instead, the moment the environment changed, so did the outcome. And that's what makes this so difficult to reconcile. Because narratives are powerful, but they only hold up as long as the evidence supports them. And just when the conversation seemed locked around officiating, the story took a turn that had nothing to do with whistles and everything to do with money. Because while debates were happening on the court, something much bigger was unfolding off it. The arrival of Caitlin Clark didn't just bring attention, it brought numbers the WNBA had never seen at this scale before. Almost overnight, ordinary regular season games started pulling extraordinary audiences. Matchups involving the Indiana Fever weren't just outperforming expectations, they were rewriting them. Broadcasts that would normally stay regional suddenly drew national attention. Arena attendance surged, merchandise moved faster, and perhaps most importantly, entirely new audiences, many of whom had never followed the league before, started tuning in consistently. At first, it looked like a temporary spike, a rookie buzz moment that might level out over time. But it didn't. The numbers kept coming. Reports and industry chatter suggested that networks were seeing engagement levels that rivaled mid-tier professional broadcasts in other leagues. Sponsors who had previously treated the WNBA as a secondary investment began leaning in with real interest. And while exact internal figures aren't always public, it's been widely discussed that the league experienced a noticeable commercial lift during that stretch. Now, to be clear, not all of this can be attributed to one player alone. The league has been growing steadily, and stars across the WNBA have contributed to that momentum over time. But there's been a lot of buzz, especially among fans and media circles, suggesting that Clark's presence accelerated that growth in a way that's hard to ignore. You could see it in the comparisons, games featuring her versus games without her. The difference in viewership, social engagement, and overall attention wasn't subtle. And once that data started stacking up, it created something the league hadn't fully had before, a clear, measurable spike tied to a specific moment. And that's where things get interesting. Because growth changes everything. It changes how leagues negotiate, it changes how sponsors invest, and most importantly, it changes how leverage is distributed behind the scenes. What was once a slow-building business suddenly had a new centerpiece driving attention at scale. Which leads to a question that a lot of people are now starting to ask, quietly at first, but more openly with each passing month. If this surge hadn't happened, would everything that followed have looked the same? That question leads directly into the most uncomfortable part of this entire conversation, because once the money enters the picture, so does the question of credit. When the new collective bargaining momentum started gaining attention, much of the public messaging centered around player leadership. Veterans spoke confidently about years of effort, experience, and unity finally paying off. And to be fair, that process is real. Negotiations don't happen overnight, and players across the league, especially established leaders, have spent years pushing for better conditions, higher salaries, and improved standards. One of the most visible voices in that conversation has been Breanna Stewart, a player whose resume and influence are unquestioned. Her framing of the situation emphasized collective strength, positioning the new agreement as the result of players fully understanding their value and negotiating from that position. On the surface, that explanation holds up, but once you zoom out and look at the timing, a more complicated picture starts to form.
Because the leverage behind any negotiation doesn't just come from effort, it comes from market conditions. It comes from what the league is worth at that exact moment. And based on publicly discussed trends and fan analysis, many believe those conditions shifted dramatically during the 2024 season. There's been a growing conversation online suggesting that the surge in viewership, sponsorship interest, and overall visibility, largely tied to the arrival of Caitlin Clark, played a significant role in strengthening the player's negotiating position. Not as the only factor, but as a catalyst that changed the scale of what was possible. And that's where opinions begin to split. Some argue this deal was the inevitable result of years of groundwork finally reaching its peak. Others believe that without the sudden commercial boost, the timeline and possibly even the terms would have looked very different. There's no single confirmed answer, and much of this remains a matter of interpretation based on available data and public trends. But what makes this debate so intense is how directly it challenges the idea of ownership over the moment. Because if the financial breakthrough was primarily driven by long-term collective effort, then the credit stays with the veteran leadership. But if the breakthrough was accelerated or even unlocked by a sudden spike in attention and revenue tied to one player's impact, then the story becomes far less straightforward. And that tension hasn't gone unnoticed. You can hear it in interviews, you can see it in how carefully words are chosen. There's an awareness that this isn't just about celebrating progress, it's about defining where that progress actually came from. And the truth is, both sides of the argument carry weight. The players negotiated the deal, that part is undeniable, but the environment in which they negotiated may not have existed in the same form just 1 year earlier, which leaves the conversation sitting in a very unusual place. Because this isn't just a debate about contracts or salaries anymore, it's a debate about who changed the league and who gets to say they did. Everything that's happened up to this point, every debate about officiating, every surge in viewership, every argument over credit, leads directly into what might be the most intense season the WNBA has ever faced. Because 2025 isn't just another year on the calendar, it's a pressure test. And at the center of it is Caitlin Clark, returning to the court with a level of scrutiny that didn't exist during her rookie season. This time, the environment is completely different. Clark isn't stepping into the season as a young player still figuring things out. She's coming back as someone who has already proven on an international stage that under a different officiating system, her game operates at an entirely different level of clarity and control. That comparison is now part of the public record. It's been watched, clipped, analyzed, and debated across platforms. And because of that, every single possession she plays in 2025 is going to be viewed through a new lens, especially when it comes to officiating. Referees are no longer operating in the same quiet space they once did. Every call and every non-call will be dissected almost instantly. Fans aren't just watching games anymore, they're reviewing them. Slow-motion clips, side-by-side comparisons, statistical breakdowns, all of it is now part of the real-time viewing experience. And a growing community of analysts and content creators has built entire platforms around tracking patterns that previously went unnoticed.
So when Clark drives to the rim and absorbs contact, the reaction won't just stay inside the arena. It will spread across social media within seconds. And if the outcome doesn't match what people saw during FIBA play, the conversation won't be quiet. It will be loud, and it will be constant. That kind of visibility creates a different kind of pressure, not just for players, but for the league itself. Because now, consistency isn't just expected, it's monitored. The margin for perceived inconsistency is smaller than ever, and the audience paying attention is larger than it's ever been. And that audience isn't just domestic anymore. The international exposure Clark gained has expanded the league's reach beyond its traditional boundaries. New viewers, new markets, new expectations. People who may not have followed the WNBA before are now watching closely, comparing what they see to other global standards of basketball.
And that means the league isn't just being evaluated internally, it's being evaluated globally. At the same time, there are new business pressures building behind the scenes. Expansion teams are entering the league, ownership groups are investing at higher levels, and those investments come with expectations. Visibility matters, marketability matters, and whether openly acknowledged or not, Clark has become a central figure in that equation. Her presence impacts ratings, attendance, and engagement in ways that ripple far beyond her own team. That creates a situation where multiple interests begin to align. Owners want growth, broadcasters want consistent viewership, sponsors want reliable exposure, and all of those things are directly influenced by how the product on the court is perceived. If the game feels inconsistent or controversial in ways that frustrate viewers, that growth becomes harder to sustain. Which means 2025 isn't just about performance, it's about perception. And then there's the internal dynamic within the league. Veteran players, rising stars, new rosters forming through expansion, all of it adds layers to an already complex environment. The conversations around credit, influence, and recognition haven't disappeared. If anything, they've intensified. And while those tensions don't always show up directly in games, they shape the atmosphere surrounding them. So every matchup carries more weight, every storyline carries more attention, every moment has the potential to be amplified beyond what we've seen before. And through all of it, Clark remains at the center, not because she asked to be, but because everything around the league now seems to orbit the impact she's had. Which is why this season feels different before it's even started. Because 2025 isn't just about proving who the best team is. It's about whether the league, its systems, and its structure can hold up under the kind of spotlight it has never experienced before. All of this builds toward a much bigger question, one that goes beyond a single season, a single player, or even a single controversy. Because what's really at stake now isn't just performance, it's credibility. And for the WNBA, 2025 is shaping up to be a full-scale test of that credibility in front of the largest audience the league has ever had. Because once a comparison like this exists, it doesn't fade away. What happened under FIBA officiating didn't just create a moment, it created a reference point. A standard that fans, analysts, and even casual viewers can now go back to whenever questions arise. And that changes how every future game is interpreted. It's no longer just about what happens on the court in isolation. It's about how it compares to what people have already seen under a different system. And that kind of comparison is powerful. Because if the product looks consistent, the league grows stronger. The conversation shifts back to basketball, competition, and talent. But if the gaps start to feel noticeable again, if similar situations produce different outcomes, it won't take long for those questions to resurface. Not quietly, and not in small circles, but publicly, across platforms, in real time. Now, to be clear, there's no confirmed evidence of any deliberate imbalance or intent behind past officiating differences. A lot of what's driving this conversation comes from fan observations, independent analysis, and ongoing debate. But perception, especially in modern sports, carries real weight. And once fans begin to question fairness or consistency, that perception can shape how the entire league is viewed.
That's where the stakes become bigger than basketball, because the WNBA isn't just managing games anymore, it's managing growth. New sponsorships, expanding media deals, increased international attention, all of it depends on the league being seen as a legitimate, consistent, and professionally officiated product. And with Caitlin Clark now positioned at the center of that growth, the spotlight becomes even more intense. Every call involving her won't just be a moment in a game, it will be part of a larger narrative. A narrative that's already been shaped by comparisons, debates, and expectations built over the past year. And whether fair or not, that narrative isn't going away. At the same time, the league has an opportunity here. Because moments like this don't just expose pressure, they create the chance to respond to it.
to set clearer standards, to reinforce consistency, to show, over time, that the product on the court can meet the expectations now placed on it. If that happens, the conversation changes completely. What was once controversy becomes validation. But if it doesn't, the gap between expectation and reality only grows wider. And in today's environment, that gap doesn't stay hidden for long. Because fans are watching differently now. They're comparing, analyzing, questioning in ways that weren't happening at this scale before. The league isn't just being consumed, it's being examined. Which is why this moment matters more than any single game or storyline. Because what happens next will define how this era of WNBA basketball is remembered, not just for its growth, not just for its stars, but for whether it could rise to meet the level of attention it worked so hard to reach. At this point, the debate isn't really about opinions anymore. It's about what people have already seen. Because once the same player performs under two different systems in front of a global audience with visibly different outcomes, that comparison doesn't disappear. It stays. It gets replayed, analyzed, and brought up every time a similar moment happens again. And that's exactly where things stand with Caitlin Clark. What unfolded between the WNBA season and the FIBA stage created something the league can't fully control anymore, a side-by-side reference that lives in the minds of fans. Same drives, same contact, different outcomes. Whether someone agrees with the interpretation or not, that visual contrast is now part of the conversation moving forward. And that changes everything. Because the explanation that once felt complete no longer answers every question. The idea of adjustment doesn't land the same way when viewers have already seen what happens under a different standard. The benefit of the doubt becomes harder to maintain when people have a direct comparison they can point to at any time. But at the same time, this isn't a closed case. There are still debates, still different perspectives. Some believe the differences are overstated. Others think they reveal something much deeper about how the game has been managed. And without official confirmation or clear acknowledgement from the league, much of this will continue to live in that space between analysis and speculation. What's undeniable, though, is the position the league now finds itself in. Because moving forward, every game carries context. Every call involving Clark will be viewed not just for what it is, but for how it compares. And in a league that's growing faster than ever, with more eyes watching than at any point in its history, that level of scrutiny becomes impossible to ignore. This is no longer just about one season or one storyline. It's about whether the game, at its highest level, can meet the expectations that have now been set in public view, whether consistency can match visibility, whether perception can align with reality, and most importantly, whether the comparison that's already been made will continue to raise questions or finally start providing answers. Because one thing is certain now, that comparison isn't going anywhere.